There's a moment in every major financial shift where the people paying attention quietly position themselves, while everyone else is still arguing about whether the shift is even real. We might be living inside one of those moments right now, and if you've been following the digital asset space for any length of time, what's happening behind the scenes right now is unlike anything we've seen before. Let me walk you through what's actually going on because the mainstream conversation is missing the most important pieces. Start with something that barely got any coverage. The Bank for International Settlements, which, if you don't know, is essentially the central bank for all the world's central banks, recently updated one of their working papers. Inside that document, buried in a footnote, they listed the major stablecoins operating in the global financial system today. They named Tether, USD Coin, and a handful of others. And at the end of that list, they included Ripple USD, also known as RLUSD. Now, you might think a footnote in a dense financial document doesn't matter, but context is everything here. The BIS doesn't casually mention things. Every word in those documents is deliberate. And the fact that RLUSD is being acknowledged at that level by that institution tells you something about where this is heading. Ripple has spent the better part of a decade building relationships with central banks. Over 50 of them. This isn't an accident. This is the result of a long, patient strategy that most people either ignored or dismissed. And here's what separates Ripple from almost every other player in this space. While the broader crypto world was posting images of banks on fire and celebrating the idea of tearing down the financial system, Ripple was sitting in boardrooms with regulators and central bank governors. While conference speakers were burning dollar bills for applause, Ripple was quietly asking a different question. What if we build something these institutions can actually use? That philosophy, that patience, is what's now showing up in footnotes inside BIS working papers. Now let's talk about the Clarity Act, because this is where things get really interesting and also where things are currently stuck. The legislation has enormous implications for the entire digital asset industry. One of the most respected voices in macro investing recently said that once this bill passes, it's going to trigger a wave of institutional money entering the space at a scale most people aren't prepared for. We're talking about traditional finance, hedge funds, banks, asset managers, all of whom have been sitting on the sidelines waiting for legal guardrails before they commit serious capital. The Clarity Act is those guardrails. But here's the sticking point. There's one section of the bill that's created a genuine standoff. It's a provision that would protect software developers, specifically people building open-source blockchain tools and wallets, from being classified as money transmitters. The argument against it, coming from groups including a coalition of religious organizations and anti-trafficking advocates, is that this could create gaps that bad actors exploit. The argument for it is that software developers shouldn't be held legally responsible for how people use the tools they build, the same way a car manufacturer isn't responsible for every decision a driver makes. This debate is real, it's serious, and right now it's the single biggest bottleneck between where we are and where this legislation needs to go. Watch this closely because when it moves, everything moves. While that's playing out in Washington, something else is happening on the technical side of the XRP ecosystem that deserves serious attention. There's been a push to implement what's called confidential transfers on the XRP Ledger. The way most public blockchains work right now, every transaction is visible. Every position, every movement of capital, every trade can be seen by anyone willing to look. For retail investors, that's fine. For a hedge fund managing billions of dollars, that's an existential problem. The moment a large institution starts building a position on a fully transparent chain, other traders can see it happening in real time and trade against them. That information leakage erodes their edge, and without that edge, they have no reason to use the chain at all. The push for confidential transactions on the XRP Ledger is a direct answer to that problem. It would allow large institutions to move capital and build positions with the same privacy they currently have in traditional banking systems, while still operating on a fast, low-cost, globally accessible ledger. This is not a minor upgrade. This is the feature that could unlock an entirely different class of institutional participant. And if you understand that, you understand why some people believe the XRP Ledger is being built not just for the current market, but for a financial system that doesn't fully exist yet. Let's talk about the bigger picture for a second, because there's a macro shift happening that goes well beyond any single bill or any single blockchain. We're entering what some serious macro thinkers are calling a great rotation. The idea is that capital is beginning to move away from the assets that dominated the last decade and toward things that have real functional utility in the emerging digital economy. Layer 1 blockchains that actually do something, that process real transactions, that settle real value, that power real applications, are starting to look deeply undervalued compared to where they could be if even a fraction of traditional finance migrates onto these rails. One prominent macro investor put it simply, the assets that produce and coordinate intelligence at scale are undervalued because of liquidity constraints, not because of a flaw in the thesis. When liquidity returns, the thesis expresses itself fast. And here's the scenario that keeps coming up in serious conversations. the one that feels almost too clean to be real but that you can't entirely dismiss. What if the legislative complexity surrounding other digital assets ends up being so tangled, so politically fraught, that the path forward for institutions becomes narrow? What if the only asset with clear, court-tested legal standing ends up being the natural anchor for the new financial infrastructure? XRP went through a multi-year legal battle. It came out the other side with something no other major digital asset has yet: actual legal clarity established through an actual court process. Not regulatory opinion, not political statements that can be reversed, a legal record. In a world where institutions need certainty before they commit, that distinction matters more than most people realize. A top 5 bank recently released their 2026 outlook, and inside it, they're openly discussing interoperability between legacy payment systems and blockchain infrastructure. The language is no longer hypothetical. They're not asking whether this happens. They're discussing how it happens and on what timeline. Swift interoperability, cross-border settlement, tokenization of real-world assets. These are moving from conference panel discussions into actual implementation planning. We're at an inflection point. The legal framework is being built. The technical infrastructure is being upgraded. The institutional appetite is real and growing. The macro environment is shifting toward utility and away from speculation. And the assets positioned at the center of all of that, the ones with regulatory clarity, institutional relationships, and technical capability, are sitting right in front of anyone willing to look past the noise. If this resonates with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit the subscribe button if you want to stay ahead of these developments as they unfold. The next few months are going to be worth paying very close attention to.